The trench line appeared abandoned. Snow had accumulated in drifts along the parapets, covering the sandbags and wooden supports the Germans had left behind 3 days earlier. The fog rolled through the Ardennes forest in thick waves, reducing visibility to 30 yards on a good moment, less when the wind died and the gray curtain descended completely. Sergeant First Class William Morrison crouched in the forward observation post and studied the tree line through his field glasses. Nothing moved. The silence was absolute except for the occasional crack of ice-laden branches breaking under their own weight. Somewhere to the west, artillery rumbled, a low, continuous thunder that had become part of the landscape, like the cold itself. Morrison lowered the glasses and checked his watch. 1400 hours. 6 hours until full darkness, though darkness hardly mattered when the fog reduced everything to shadows and suggestions. His breath formed clouds that hung in the frozen air before dissipating. Behind him, stretched along 200 yards of captured German trench, 17 men from 3rd Platoon, Baker Company, held what remained of their defensive line. The rest of the platoon had been pulled back 2 days ago for reorganization after the initial German assault. These 17 had been left behind with orders to hold the position until relieved. No one knew when relief would come. Morrison moved along the trench, his boots crunching on frozen earth. The men had tried to make the position livable. They'd reinforced the sandbagged walls where German artillery had collapsed them, cleared the dugouts of debris and the frozen remains of the previous defenders. They'd positioned ammunition caches at intervals, redistributed grenades, and inventoried what they'd captured when the Germans abandoned this sector in their rapid advance westward. The haul had been useful. 6 Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, dozens of steel hand grenade stick grenades, and several MG 42 machine guns with belted ammunition. The Americans had added these to their own M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, and a single M1919 Browning machine gun. It was enough firepower to make the position defensible, provided the ammunition lasted and the weapons didn't freeze. Everything froze in the Ardennes in December. Oil congealed in rifle actions. Water bottles became blocks of ice. Hands lost feeling even inside gloves. Men learned to keep ammunition inside their jackets to prevent cold-induced malfunctions. They learned to breathe through scarves to avoid burning their lungs with the bitter air. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski sat in a dugout cleaning his M1 Garand with methodical precision. The ritual had become meditation. Field strip, inspect, oil sparingly, reassemble. He'd done it 3 times already today. Around him, the dugout was cramped and dark, lit only by a stub of candle that threw dancing shadows on the earthen walls. His hands shook slightly, not from cold but from exhaustion and the steady diet of fear that had become normal. Kowalski had been in the Ardennes for 11 days. He'd arrived as a replacement after the German offensive shattered the front lines on December 16th. He'd never fired his rifle at another human being before that morning. Now he couldn't remember how many times he'd pulled the trigger. The memories blurred together. Muzzle flashes in fog, the distinctive crack of German Mauser rifles, the screams of wounded men lost in the snow. The radio in the command dugout crackled with static. Corporal James Chun hunched over the SCR 300 backpack radio, adjusting dials and checking connections for the 100th time. The equipment had been unreliable since they'd occupied the position. Sometimes they could reach battalion headquarters 5 miles to the rear. More often, they got nothing but atmospheric interference and the ghost voices of other units scattered across the vast forest. Chun had been a radio man for 8 months. He knew the equipment intimately, knew its quirks and limitations. The problem wasn't technical. The batteries were good, the antenna properly deployed. The problem was the terrain and the weather. Radio waves did strange things in the Ardennes in winter. Signals bounced off fog banks, disappeared into valleys, emerged miles from their intended destination. He tried again, speaking slowly into the handset, calling the battalion frequency. Static answered. He logged the attempt in his notebook, noting the time and atmospheric conditions. If they survived, the notes might help someone understand what happened here. Morrison returned to the observation post, as the fog thickened. Visibility had dropped to 20 yards. The forest beyond the wire had disappeared entirely, replaced by a gray void that seemed to absorb sound and light equally. He didn't like it. Fog could hide anything, a single scout or an entire armored column. The defensive plan was simple because it had to be. 17 men couldn't defend 200 yards of trench against a determined assault. They could make it costly. They could delay. They could force the enemy to commit forces and reveal positions. But if the Germans came in strength, 3rd Platoon's remnants would die in place or surrender. Morrison had no intention of surrendering. He'd positioned his best riflemen at intervals along the line with clear fields of fire toward the most likely approach routes. The captured MG-42s were placed at the trench corners, covering the flanks. The Panzerfaust were distributed to men who'd studied the captured German instruction manuals and practiced with the unfamiliar weapons during quiet moments. Mines had been their salvation. The Germans had left dozens of Tellermine anti-tank mines in a dugout, probably intended for use elsewhere before the rapid advance forced an improvised withdrawal. Morrison's men had planted them along the forest track that served as the main approach to their position. They'd marked the minefield in their own maps and hoped no one from their own side would blunder into it. The afternoon wore on. Men dozed in dugouts, wrapped in every piece of clothing they possessed. Others kept watch, stamping their feet to maintain circulation, scanning the fog for movement that never came. Kowalski heated a can of hash over a small fire made from wood stripped from ammunition crates. The smell filled the dugout, a reminder that some pleasures still existed even in this frozen hell. At 1500 hours, the artillery changed. Morrison heard it first, a shift in the distant thunder, growing closer and more concentrated. He grabbed his field glasses and moved to the observation post, straining to see through the fog. The sound intensified, then suddenly the air filled with the distinctive whistle of incoming rounds. The first shells landed 200 yards to the rear, erupting in fountains of frozen earth and splintered trees. The bombardment walked forward methodically, each salvo 50 yards closer than the last. German artillery observers were ranging in, searching for the trench line they knew was there but couldn't see through the fog. Morrison shouted down the trench, his voice barely audible over the explosions. Men scrambled into dugouts and covered positions. The bombardment reached the trench line and hell arrived with it. High explosive shells detonated along the parapets, collapsing sandbag walls and filling the air with shrapnel and debris. The earth shook with each impact. Kowalski pressed himself against the dugout wall, hands over his ears, mouth open to equalize pressure. The candle had gone out, leaving him in absolute darkness, punctuated by orange flashes visible through the dugout entrance. The shelling lasted 12 minutes. Then silence returned, somehow more oppressive than before. Morrison emerged from cover, ears ringing, to assess damage. 2 sections of trench had collapsed entirely. 1 dugout had taken a direct hit. The 4 men inside were gone, reduced to scattered remains and blood-stained snow. The survivors were shaken but functional, already clearing debris and reinforcing damaged positions. Shouldn't try the radio again. Nothing. The antenna had been shredded by shrapnel. Without communications, they were truly alone. Then they heard the engines. The sound came from the northwest, muffled by fog but unmistakable. Heavy diesel engines, multiple vehicles, moving slowly through the forest. Tank tracks clanked against frozen ground. Commanders shouted orders in German, their voices carrying strangely through the heavy air. Morrison counted engine sounds. At least 4 tanks, probably more. Infantry would be following, using the armor as cover and psychological support. This wasn't a probe. It was a deliberate assault designed to clear this section of line and continue the German advance westward. He moved along the trench, checking positions and redistributing the Panzerfausts. The weapons were simple but deadly. A disposable tube launching a shape-charged warhead capable of penetrating any tank in the German arsenal. The problem was range. The Panzerfaust was only effective at 50 yards or less, requiring the user to wait until the last possible moment before firing. Waiting meant nerves. It meant watching tons of steel and armor roll toward your position while every instinct screamed to run. It meant trusting that your hands wouldn't shake, that the weapon wouldn't misfire, that the warhead would penetrate and the tank would die before its machine guns found you. Kowalski held one of the Panzerfausts, feeling its weight and balance. He'd practiced with captured equipment at a training area behind the lines, firing at knocked-out German vehicles. The training had been brief and hurried, but he'd learned the basics. Remove the safety, flip up the sights, aim at the center mass, squeeze the trigger. The backblast would be tremendous. He needed to make sure no one stood behind him and that the rear of the weapon had clearance. The engine sounds grew louder. Through the fog, shapes began to materialize, darker gray against the lighter gray, moving with mechanical precision. The first tank emerged from the tree line 100 yards away, a Panther medium tank with its distinctive sloped armor and long 75mm gun. The vehicle paused, turret traversing as the commander scanned for targets through the fog. Behind the Panther came infantry, 24 German soldiers in winter camouflage moving in dispersed formation. They advanced cautiously, rifles ready, searching the fog for the trench line they knew was ahead. Morrison held his fire. Every man in the trench held fire, watching the Germans approach, letting them come closer. At 75 yards, the Panther lurched forward again, angling slightly to the right. The tank commander was visible in the open cupola, scanning with binoculars. 60 yards. The German infantry had nearly reached the minefield. Morrison could see individual faces now, young men as cold and frightened as his own soldiers, following orders and hoping to survive another day. 50 yards. The lead German soldier stepped on a teller mine. The explosion threw the man backward, his legs gone below the knees. His comrades dove for cover as more mines detonated in a chain reaction of fire and steel. The Panther's commander dropped into the turret and buttoned up, momentarily blinded by the smoke and debris. Morrison fired a flare pistol into the air. The red star burst above the battlefield, the signal to open fire. The trench line erupted. M1 Garand's cracked in rapid, semi-automatic fire, the distinctive 8-round clip ping echoing across the snow. The bar gunners opened up with sustained bursts, sweeping the area where German infantry had gone aground. The captured MG-42s added their high-pitched rattle, firing at nearly twice the rate of American weapons. The Panther's turret swung toward the muzzle flashes. Its main gun fired, the shell striking the trench parapet and detonating in a burst of earth and sandbags. The coaxial machine gun began firing, tracers reaching out through the fog. Kowalski waited. The Panther advanced, crushing a destroyed German body under its tracks. 40 yards. 35. The tank's machine gun walked fire along the trench line, forcing men to duck below the parapet. 30 yards. He stood, shouldered the Panzerfaust, flipped up the sights. The Panther's hull filled his vision, gray steel scored with scratches and battle damage, track guards caked with frozen mud, the distinctive German cross barely visible through grime and camouflage paint. 25 yards. He aimed at the lower glassy plate where the armor was thinnest, squeezed the trigger. The Panzerfaust roared, the backblast filling the trench with smoke and fire. The shaped charge warhead struck the Panther just below the turret ring and penetrated. For a moment, nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the tank's hatches. The engine coughed and died. The whole machine gun fell silent. The commander's hatch popped open and a man emerged, uniform on fire, and fell from the tank to lie motionless in the snow. A second Panther appeared from the fog, firing on the move. Its shell struck the trench directly, killing 2 men and collapsing another section of parapet. German infantry surged forward, using the fog and smoke for cover, firing from the hip as they advanced. Morrison grabbed a captured steel hand grenade, pulled the cord to arm it, and hurled the stick grenade toward the advancing Germans. The explosion was followed by screams. More grenades flew from both sides, turning the space between the trench and the tree line into a killing ground. The battle dissolved into chaos. Individual soldiers fought their own desperate actions, firing at shadows and movement, reloading by feel, watching comrades fall and pressing on because there was nowhere to retreat. The fog amplified every sound and distorted every perception, creating a hellscape where death came from nowhere and survival was pure chance. Kowalski fired his M1 until the clip ejected with its distinctive ping, reloaded, fired again. A German soldier appeared at the trench edge, rifle raised. Kowalski shot him in the chest, and the man tumbled backward. Another German came, then another. The trench was being overrun. Then the German assault broke. Perhaps they'd taken too many casualties. Perhaps their commander decided the position wasn't worth the cost. Perhaps the fog and the unseen defenses created psychological pressure that numbers couldn't overcome. Whatever the reason, the German infantry began pulling back, dragging wounded with them, leaving their dead in the snow. The 2nd Panther fired one more shell that screamed overhead and detonated somewhere in the rear area. Then it too withdrew, backing into the fog with practiced precision. Its gun trained on the American position until it disappeared completely. Silence returned gradually, the gunfire fading to sporadic shots, and then to nothing. The fog absorbed the sounds of the German withdrawal until only the wind remained, and the distant artillery that never stopped. Morrison walked the trench line, counting 9 men still on their feet. For wounded, too seriously enough to need evacuation that wouldn't come. For dead, the position held but barely. Another assault would finish them. He checked ammunition. Less than 50 rounds per rifle. The bar gunner had 2 magazines left. The machine gun had 1 belt. The captured German weapons were out of ammunition entirely. They'd used all but one of the Panzerfausts. Chun worked on the radio with desperate concentration, trying to rig a field-expedient antenna from wire and debris. After an hour, he managed to raise battalion headquarters for 30 seconds before the signal dissolved back into static. It was enough. He'd reported their situation, requested reinforcement or withdrawal authorization, and learned that neither was possible. Hold the line. Relief would come when possible. Night fell without transition, the fog darkening from gray to black. The temperature dropped further. Men huddled in dugouts, sharing body heat, too exhausted to sleep properly, dozing in brief intervals and jerking awake at imagined sounds. Kowalski sat with his back against the frozen earthen wall, his M1 across his knees, and thought about nothing. His mind had gone somewhere beyond fear, beyond exhaustion, to a place where only the immediate moment existed. The cold, the darkness, the rifle in his hands. Nothing else was real. Morrison maintained watch through the night, rotating men through the observation post to prevent anyone from freezing in place. The fog persisted, thick and impenetrable, hiding whatever the Germans were planning in the forest beyond. At 0400 hours, he heard vehicles again, different engines this time, higher pitched and more familiar. American engines. The sound grew closer, resolved into the distinctive rumble of Sherman tanks, accompanied by the lighter note of half-track personnel carriers. The relief column had arrived. By dawn, 3rd Platoon's remnants had been evacuated to the rear. Fresh troops occupied the trench line, reinforcing the position with sandbags and mines and heavy weapons. The war moved on, as it always did, leaving the ghost line behind with its dead buried in shallow graves and its survivors scattered to other battles. In the official after-action report, the engagement was described as a successful defense of a critical position against enemy armor and infantry. Casualties were listed. Equipment expenditure was noted. The report was filed, classified, and forgotten. But the men who'd held that trench carried it with them. They carried the fog and the cold, the sound of tank engines in the darkness, the faces of the German soldiers they'd killed, the friends who hadn't survived. They carried the knowledge that survival was often arbitrary, that courage was sometimes just the inability to run, that war reduced everything to the simplest equation: hold or die. The ghost line remained, abandoned again and reoccupied and abandoned through the winter of 1944 as the battle lines shifted back and forth across the Ardennes. By spring, when the snow melted and the fog lifted, The trenches had collapsed, and the forest was reclaiming its own. The war moved east toward Germany, leaving behind only the graves and the memories and the silence of the forest that had witnessed it all. Decades later, historians would analyze the Battle of the Bulge with maps and statistics, calculating casualties and assessing strategic decisions. They would debate whether the German offensive ever had a chance of success, whether Allied response was adequate, what lessons could be learned. But none of their analyses would capture the reality of 17 men in a frozen trench, watching shadows emerge from fog, holding a line because orders said to hold, surviving not through heroism, but through stubbornness and luck and the small acts of competence that accumulate into something that resembles victory. The ghost line held. That was all that mattered. That was everything.